Thank you for having me. Trying to get the right angle here. I appreciate being here. I'm always happy to talk about one of my favorite subjects, local concert history. Okay. Need this thing to be a little taller. Okay. So, like a lot of people, I'm a music nerd. My parents raised me right. I was raised on the Beatles, classic country, Motown, and singer-songwriters of the 70s. And they didn't object when I veered into pop music and modern rock and rap as I grew up. I first started writing about music at the Battalion in my college days, covering shows and interviewing artists. That continued through my career at the Eagle and at the Dallas Morning News. The arts have always been a passion of mine, and I'm very pleased to be in a new role in a new school that's directly tied to the arts at the School of Performance, Visualization, and Fine Arts. So, how did this book happen? I knew some of the basics. I knew some of the famous shows that had come through here. I knew about Willie's Picnic in '74. I knew Elvis had played at G. Raleigh, and I knew about Lyle, Lovett, and Robert Earl Keane. But there was a lot that I didn't know. And around 2012, I was doing research at Cushing Library for the Eagles Aggie website, My Aggie Nation. And I was researching concerts, all the great shows that Town Hall brought over the years. And I found lots of old Eagles stories, lots of old Battalion stories, things that I did not know about. The primary one is the Johnny Cash story, which I will get to in just a minute. I'm a big Johnny Cash fan, but I had no idea about his history here. And so that got me thinking there's lots of great stories to tell here. The other big one was Elvis. I knew he had played at G. Raleigh. I attended a ceremony for the former Journalism Student Association, which was honoring Denny Freeman, who was an Associated Press writer for a long, long time, covered the Cowboys and other things. And he mentioned that he saw Elvis at G. Raleigh. And so I sort of tucked that away and thought if I ever do something, I need to get back in touch with him. So once I had those stories identified, I was looked for other shows, and that took me to Nat King Cole playing at G. Raleigh, REM, more modern acts, all the great town hall shows that they brought over the decades, really. And then also, people that were really important to bringing local concerts. Johnny Lyon at the Texas Hall of Fame was hugely responsible for bringing some of the biggest acts. Willie Bennett, who booked every venue in town for probably 20 plus years. They were very, influential. One story kind of led to another. As I was interviewing people for the tribute chapter to Willie Bennett, I was interviewing Brian Lippman, who owned Lippman Music and still plays music all over town. And I mentioned that I had heard of a concert by the Ramones in the 1980s, and did he have any stories about that? And he said, I got some stories about that. And so that took me tumbling into a new chapter. So it was a really fun sort of discovery process. And so I think the reason I wanted to write this book was that we all know that this area is not known for music, especially not with Austin so close. But we have a bunch of really interesting stories about singer-songwriters, bands coming through town. And there are lots of A&M history books, politics, sports, military, but there was nothing about this. And so I thought, these are chapters in a book that need to be told. So, Live from Aggieland came out in 2017. Robert Earl Keane, who I've covered for years, wrote the foreword, which was a real thrill. I always tell people it's the best part of the whole book, and I'm still really honored that he did that. I'm grateful to the Texas A&M University Press. It's a real thrill to have had this published. And I have copies here if you'd like to purchase one. It makes a lovely gift. Where's the clicker? Here it is. So we'll start with Elvis. When I was getting curious about all this back at the Eagle, I went through the microfilm and found this old ad for the G. Raleigh show, and also a short little preview. So he played G. Raleigh on October 3rd, 1955. He was a rising artist, but he was not the famous Elvis by any stretch. That's All Right Mama was a big song, Blue Moon of Kentucky, but that was really it. This is less than a year before he became Elvis. In the following year, he had Hound Dog, Heartbreak Hotel, and Don't Be Cruel, and had his monumental appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. So it was a really interesting time for people here to catch him. So the Eagle did a short preview. See a little tiny thing up there. And so the headline was Cool King of Bop Headlines Hayride Show. And the story basically focused on what he wore. This is a direct quote. The Western Bop King prefers the cool cat type of dress to more conventional cowboy attire and has acquired a huge collection of unusual and flashy clothes. So, okay. So I started looking for people who had gone to the show, first being Denny Freeman from the Associated Press. I talked to him about his memories of the show. The main reason he was there was to get away from the upperclassmen. I guess that's what life in the Corps was like back then. And another source was Lloyd Taylor, who was a football player in the Junction Boys era. So there's an account of this evening in the book The Junction Boys by Jim Dent. The story goes that during the show at G. Raleigh, Elvis spit out his gum on stage. And the cadets were not pleased by that. Dent wrote that the cadets were saying that he had desecrated the stage and, quote, somebody knocked that blank off of there. So the most extreme portion of this anecdote was that, quote, swords were suddenly drawn. But, I don't know Jim Dent, but he doesn't quote anyone specifically saying that. He lists a lot of people that he interviewed in the acknowledgments, but he doesn't quote someone specifically saying that swords were suddenly drawn. So Denny Freeman didn't recall that. Lloyd Taylor had a different memory saying that the students were respectful and they got upset, but they never created any problem or anything. There's a book called Elvis in Texas that Stanley Oberst wrote, and I interviewed him for my book. He said Elvis spitting was kind of part of his act back then. Why, I don't know, but, and he said Elvis apologized and, quote, some of the cadets came to his defense. They realized he didn't mean anything rude toward Texas A&M or the guys. They calmed down and Elvis finished his part of the show. So were swords drawn? I don't know. I wish there were sources listed that said that specifically, but that's what I have discovered about it. What really surprised me about Elvis was that was not the first time he played here. Scott DeLucia at WTAW helped point me toward the history of A.J. Wynn, who was a country artist and a very influential DJ at WTAW. And a lot of musicians coming through Texas would seek his advice and his counsel. His son, Buddy Wynn, who is the longtime tax assessor collector for the county, sat down with me and shared stories about it. The Eagle did a profile of A.J. Wynn that talked about how Elvis came to find him. And Elvis told him at the studio that he was a, quote, pretty good singer. So A.J. invited him to come to the Wynn house and stay for a while. Buddy told me that happened a lot. Johnny Horton and Lefty Frizzell spent time with the Wynn family. What a cool house that must have been. And so Elvis stayed with them for about a week, and he would go with A.J. to dance halls and beer joints and sort of learn the ropes from A.J. Wynn. This is, sorry, I'm already off track. This is Elvis at G. Raleigh. That's the only on-stage photo that I'm aware of him performing. So, pretty cool shot. Tracking that down was a bit of a challenge. This is a ticket from the Bryan Saddle Club Rodeo Show. This was August 23rd, 1955, so about a month and a half before the G. Raleigh show. Buddy Wynn was there, and I was able to get in touch with another man, Jimmy Nash, who was there, and he actually held on to his ticket all these years and was kind enough to share that picture with me. The highlight for Mr. Nash, this is sort of rivaling the spitting on stage thing. He said that Elvis drove in from Caldwell with a young woman from Caldwell, and she never left the car upon arrival. After Elvis was done singing, a jealous boyfriend from Caldwell showed up. And according to Mr. Nash, this is a direct quote, he confronted Elvis. the jealous boyfriend. Somehow, Elvis came up with a guitar, a hollow body, and man, he reared back and splatters this old guy. It busted the guitar up. He whacked him pretty good. It was just like you see in the cartoons, or like it was staged. And then that was it. The fight was over. No cops, no arrests. I always think, what would happen now in the age of social media and TMZ if something like that happened? But that was it. And then less than a year later, Elvis was everywhere. Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Ed Sullivan Show that 60 million people watched. And that happened just after he was here in Bryan College Station. So, next, good old Johnny Cash. This is what really got me interested in this book. This is 1965. He's already a big star, and he was booked to play the post-bonfire concert on campus. On October 4th, he was arrested in El Paso. He had crossed the border into Juarez, and he acquired more than 1,000 pills there. Amphetamines, all kinds of stuff. He was a struggling addict way back then. So a debate began on campus. Should this concert continue? On November 9th, MSC Council decided they would keep it as scheduled. And then 4 days later, President Rudder canceled it. He was quoted as saying, "I did not try to prejudge Johnny Cash because only a court of law can do this, but nobody can dispute that he has been caught with pep pills." J. Wayne Stark was MSC director at the time. He was quoted as saying the cancellation was due to unfavorable publicity originating from El Paso. So there were some students who were outraged by this. Lots of letters to the editor and the battalion, as you can imagine. The paper ran an editorial about how Cash was innocent until proven guilty. And then some students got together, and both grad and undergrad students, and they created the Committee for Johnny Cash, starting a petition to reinstate the show. They also connected with Saul Holliff, who was Cash's manager, and they managed to make a deal to bring Johnny Cash to town anyway, on the exact same night he was supposed to play the post-bonfire concert. But they brought him to the Lakeview Amusement Club on Tabor Road, which had a long history of bringing in top country acts. So they had a pillow protest concert. And students brought pillows to sit on. It was very crowded. The estimate was that 1,000 people showed up. June Carter was an opening act before she was married to Johnny Cash, along with the Statler brothers. And one of my favorite little nuggets about this was a reference in the Battalion Review, which noted that the Statler brothers were singing their current hit about counting flowers on the wall and watching Captain Kangaroo. So Flowers on the Wall is a signature, wonderful song that everybody knows from the Statler brothers. Back then it was just their new song. So Cash didn't directly reference the controversy on stage, but he did dedicate a song to, quote, the man who changed our location. And that song was called Dirty Old Egg-Sucking Dog. So that was his big statement. From most accounts, it was a tremendous show that everyone enjoyed. I interviewed Glenn Dromgoole, who was editor of the Battalion at the time, and he saw Johnny Cash backstage. And Glenn told me, quote, he was higher than a kite. And after all that, in March the following year, Johnny Cash pleaded guilty to the drug charges. And the AP quoted him as saying, it was bad, very bad misconduct on my part. So I thought that was an interesting story. So another sort of controversial time here in town, Willie Nelson's picnic in 1974. So it was Willie's second picnic. The first one in '73 was in Dripping Springs. And the Texas World Speedway provided better infrastructure than Dripping Springs had, like parking and plumbing. And you could see that there was a little wariness in the community about it based on the fantastic coverage in the Eagle. There was an editorial in June that said, quote, the festival is coming whether we like it or not. So that continued as the show approached, and this is one of my favorite things. The top of the page there, pictures of the long-haired fans coming in, 4th of July picnickers move in, whoopee. So real sarcasm coming from the Eagle front page there. It was a 3-day event. It was really hot all 3 days. They had built a 4,000 square foot stage in the middle of the infield. The first day was most known for the big fire that happened in the grass parking lot. The story is that a man fell asleep in his car in the grass parking lot. The grass caught fire. The fire spread and destroyed about a dozen cars. And famously, one of those cars belonged to a young Robert Earl Keane, who was just a teenager in Houston at the time. They came on the PA system, started announcing license plate numbers, and Robert has a famous monologue on his live album where he tells the story, and it's hysterical. And if you haven't heard it, I highly suggest you listen to that. The silver lining was he got to meet Willie. So there's that. And a photo of his car eventually made its way back to him, and he used it on the cover of his 1997 album, which was called Picnic. So the first day brought about 20,000 people. The Eagle covered it thoroughly, complete with photo spreads of people sharing joints. There was definitely some culture shock at play here. There's an Eagle story you see there: music, fire, heat, pot equals picnic. And here's a quote from the story. People were dancing and singing, drinking and smoking, and the air was so saturated with marijuana fumes that you didn't need to drag a joint to inhale its heavy sweetness. You could smell it, taste it, and feel it all around you. There was also some nudity, maybe not uncommon for music festivals in the 70s, but not terribly common at Bryan College Station. The Eagle ran several photos with black bars covering certain things. And I will say that the Eagle was criticized for focusing too much on drugs and nudity throughout the event. There were, let's see, it's hard to tell, but you can see an aerial shot of the crowd, Willie on stage, fire, chaos, emergency vehicles. There were people sent to the ER, there were arrests. I interviewed Michael Martin Murphy about it years ago. He called it Disasterville. His quote was, "They just weren't prepared for it. It was like 105 degrees. Nobody knows how many people were there, but it had to be at least 25,000. It was an absolutely clear blue sky, just baking in the sun. They didn't have hardly any security. It was pretty chaotic." Having said that, the music was pretty great. And by most accounts, he was right. It's hard to find anyone who didn't have a good time in terms of the music. Besides Willie, there was Waylon Jennings, Asleep at the Wheel, Guy Clark, Jerry Jeff Walker, Billy Joe Shaver, Willis Allen Ramsey, Ray Wiley Hubbard, Doug Kershaw, even Jimmy Buffett pre-Margaritaville. Leon Russell was the master of ceremonies. There is a documentary film about it that's sometimes on YouTube, but I would caution you, there's some adult situations on it. There was a backlash, as you might imagine. A lot of people in the community sort of had a hard time with this event being there. That's evident in the many, many letters to the editor and stories in the Eagle afterward. An editorial pointed out that there were drug arrests and there was nudity, but the music was good and the crowd was peaceable. The Chamber of Commerce and the City Council were not pleased, and there were church advertisements in the Eagle that called it repulsive. So the Eagle ran, this is interesting, the Eagle ran a reader poll that people would either bring in or mail in. And it asked 4 questions. Did you go? Did you like it? Would you like to see it return? And was it bad for our community? And it got about over 1,600 results, but only 19% of those people actually went to the event. So the answers made it pretty clear that those who went enjoyed it. Those who didn't, did not. Just 25% were in favor of it coming back. Those who did want it to come back went to the show. 75% were against it, a total of 1,177 people. 34 of them went to the event. So it shows you the disparity there. Willie included one paragraph about this in his autobiography, one of his autobiographies. Quote, "There were a few wrecks, a few cars caught fire, but overall the crowd, estimated at a whopping 75,000, had a ball, proving to the world that this picnic was all about peace, love, and good music of all stripes." And the picnic is still going strong to this day. A friend of mine and also an Aggie grad, Dave Thomas, who is a picnic expert, helped me with this chapter, and he is finishing up a book right now about the history of the picnic. So that is something to keep an eye on. Let's see. Okay. 2 pillars of our local music history, Lyle, Lovett, and Robert Earl Keane. Robert was an English major. Lyle was a journalism major. Robert lived in a house he rented from Jack Boyette on Church Avenue with his roommate Brian Duckworth, who played fiddle with Robert for years and years. Robert and Lyle were not roommates, which is often confused. Robert and Brian would play out on the porch, and this is what Robert told me in an interview a few years back. We were a bunch of little rednecks. All my friends, they're dipping snuff, drinking coffee out of beer cans, then drinking beer out of beer cans, and then drinking to drink. And we made some comment about everybody who walked or rode by while we were picking and grinning. And we were like, who's that dude on the 10-speed? And that was Lyle Lovett, who was on a 10-speed and just heard them playing and stopped and listened to them play. And then he played a song, and that's sort of how they began a friendship. There's also another great Robert monologue from his live album about the front porch, which, again, he can tell it better than I ever could try. That's where the front porch song came from, a signature song for them both. Robert wrote the first 3 verses, sort of the metaphorical aspect, and the great visuals like a steaming, greasy plate of enchiladas. Lyle wrote the last ones and turned the focus back on Robert and his relationship with Jack Boyette and how Robert would help him with tasks around ranch tasks. Lyle told me in an interview, I just always admired Robert for his kindness toward this older gentleman and how Robert saw value in that relationship beyond just landlord-tenant. So, of course, they went on to huge things, highly successful solo careers. They've both been honored as distinguished alumni. They are both in the Texas Heritage Songwriters Hall of Fame. They've collaborated on songs. They've covered each other's songs. Lyle has even mentioned Robert by name twice in songs, one called Record Lady and one called San Antonio Girl. And they've played here in town a few times, but none were as special as the Bonfire Benefit Concert in February 2000, and that's what this is from. After the bonfire collapse in November '99, they came together and raised almost $100,000 for the families of the victims. They had not performed on a major concert stage here in town prior to that, so it was a very a special night. I was there. It was an emotional show. They showed a video that included images of the 12 students who died. They had a message from John Comstock, the last survivor to be pulled from the stack. A very emotional scene, and the show was broadcast directly to his hospital room. Robert and Lyle's bands were on stage at the same time. They did duets, they traded songs, they chimed in on each other's songs, and when Robert played The Road Goes On Forever, he busted a couple of strings on his guitar and just kept playing as hard as he could through the end of the song, just pounding away at his guitar. Easily the best concert I've seen here, and one of my favorite all-time shows. Garth Brooks. Okay, so Garth Brooks first came to town in 1991. He was a popular rising star at the time. He had already had The Dance, Much Too Young to Be Feeling This Damn Old, Friends in Low Places. Dave Salmon, who was the advisor to MSC Town Hall for a long time, told me about how after that show, Garth had a pinched nerve in his back, but after the show he iced it down. And then he went outside and signed autographs until 3 a.m. or something like that. So he already had an impact here. By the time 1998 came around, he was the biggest star on the planet, regardless of genre. He was everywhere. It's crazy to think just how big a star he was at that time. It's comparable to Beyonce and Taylor Swift now. And his world tour was coming to an end, and it ended here with 3 shows at Reed Arena. It was a really exciting time, even if you weren't a Garth Brooks fan. One of the most interesting things was how they handled the tickets. One show, just one, was announced, but there was an expectation for more because of how big he was. So you had to get a wristband, and then a few days later, you had to go back to where you got the wristband, which was Reed Arena. So this is not to get into the show, this is to get a wristband. And then you had to go back on Saturday with your wristband to have a chance at tickets. I was at Reed that Saturday morning. There was a lot of this. So they had a lottery, and so the first number that came up got ticket access, and then every number after that person got tickets. 24 minutes later, the show was sold out. Then they announced another show on site, and that sold out. And then a third show, So Thursday, Friday, Saturday. They probably could have sold that a week if they wanted to. What's really interesting is that MSC Town Hall had already booked Faith Hill to play Rudder Auditorium on that Friday night. So they basically worked out a deal that anyone who bought a ticket to Faith Hill's concert would have access to Garth's concert on Saturday, access to buying tickets. So the rest of the Faith Hill tickets sold out real quick, and then they all had access to Garth. So there was a press conference before his first Reed show, and I was there. And I have to mention the WTAW pickle. They had this plastic pickle, like a pool toy, and they would have celebrities pose with it when they came to the station. They've revived this tradition in recent years, I'm happy to say. So Jay Sokol, who was on the Infomaniacs show back then, asked a receptionist to take the pickle to the press conference to try to get a picture of Garth Brooks with the pickle. And she did. And as Jay told me, quote, what she described was him being very nervous, very concerned, and almost leaning backward away from her, declining the offer, firmly declining the offer. I was so shocked when she came back and told me this because I thought surely she did not have the courage to ask Garth Brooks to pose with a giant pool pickle. And she was more of a man than I was or ever would be because I would not have dared to ask Garth Brooks that question. It was a really exciting time around town to have a star that size here. The shows were big, the vibe was electric. Garth works really hard in concert to make sure that everyone has a good time. Even if you're not a fan, it's kind of hard to not get caught up in it. Steve Wariner sang a song, Trisha Yearwood sang a song, it was before they were married. Garth covered a few George Strait songs that night, and that led to rumors that George was going to join him on stage in one of the shows after that. That was false, it didn't happen. But it was a great show. So the second night, I went to cover Faith Hill at Rudder, and I went back for the final Garth show on the third night. And let me just say how weird it is to say, I went to Garth one night, Faith Hill the next night, Garth Brooks the third night, in Bryan College Station. The third show was another great show, but more emotional for the band because it was their last show of the whole tour, which had lasted a long time. He brought his parents on stage. His mother had been battling throat cancer. She would pass a year later. He ended with a bunch of interesting cover songs. He did Piano Man. He did Night Moves by Bob Seger. He did Cat Stevens' Wild World. And he ended it with American Pie by Don McLean and had the whole building singing along to American Pie. It was really something to witness. And I don't know if we'll ever have that kind of experience here again, but it was really something, and I'm glad I was there. There are other little stories that didn't make full chapters. There are some vignettes in the back of the book. One of my favorites is Johnny Mathis in 1967 playing at G. Raleigh when the power went out, and he tried to sing without a microphone for a while. He gave his best efforts, and it turns out that a rat was to blame. The Eagle headline was "Rat Fink Hits Mathis Show." The quote was, "The trouble was finally traced to a switchgear located in the transformer complex of the Southside substation. There was about 14 inches, including tail, of Rat Fink, thoroughly electrocuted for his trespassing." So that did it. There were other shows that I wanted to do more on. Simon and Garfunkel played here. I'm a huge Simon and Garfunkel fan. Elton John, the Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, John Denver, the Ohio Players. A lot of it depended on reviews and coverage in the Eagle and the Battalion. To have the event documented was a huge help in getting started. Memories do tend to fade as the years go by. There are great shows I saw in college, but if you ask me now what happened, I'd say, oh, it was a great show. So I talked to people who saw Simon and Garfunkel, and they said, great show, but that's all they really remembered, which is normal. I can't write a chapter based on those memories, but so basically, as always, local journalism is very important. Since the book came out, there's been one enormous local show, the Hurricane Harvey benefit concert at Reed Arena, where the 5 living presidents were there, and a great lineup: Lyle and Robert Earl, Yolanda Adams, Alabama, Gatlin Brothers, Sam Moore, and Lady Gaga, which is was quite a revelation. It was a surprise performance. I was in the green room hours before the concert started, and suddenly I heard just this enormous, burst of screaming from the people who were already in the arena, and it was Lady Gaga doing sound check. And even if you're not a fan, it's the power of her voice was really something, and that was really an amazing night. So Reed Arena doesn't really book big shows anymore. I get asked that a lot. Why don't we get the big shows like this anymore? I can't speak for Reed, of course, but I will say that my understanding is that the cost of bringing in major artists is astronomical these days. They don't make money on albums like they used to. They don't make money off of streaming, hardly at all. And so they make their money on tour. And so the cost of getting a top star is just off the charts. And Reed Arena sort of runs like a business, and they don't get student fees. At least that was the case when I wrote the book. Maybe it's changed in the years since now. But so I don't know. People ask me if we'll ever get big shows like that again, and I don't know. I hope so, because they're a lot of fun, but I don't really know. There were people also that were really critical to concerts, local concerts. Like I mentioned, Johnny Lyon at the Hall of Fame, Willie Bennett. One of my favorite Willie stories is he booked a little band that not many people knew of to play Shadow Canyon, and by the time they got here, they were the Dixie Chicks, and they were huge already. But he had booked them months in advance, and by the time they got here, they were huge. And that was a really memorable show. And on campus, Dave Salmon, who's since retired, in Town Hall, bringing so many great acts over the years. In my college days, we saw fun, weird little groups like They Might Be Giants and Belly and Digital Underground and Tori Amos. I saw Chris Rock way before he was a comedy superstar at Rudder Auditorium. So lots of great memories. This book was a lot of fun to put together. One thing I always enjoy is people saying, oh, I was at that show, or they were at a show that I didn't get to, and hearing their stories. So it was really a passion project, and I'm proud of it and grateful to the University Press. So that's all I've got.